You're listening to the Anxiety Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Georgie Collinson, anxiety mindset coach, naturopath, hypnotherapist, and creator of the Anxiety Reset Method. This is where I help women with high-functioning anxiety, just like you, master that anxious mind. Well, Nicole, welcome to the show. I am very, very happy to be here discussing timeline anxiety and all of this stuff with you. Welcome.
As am I. Thank you so much for having me.
So I was just saying just before we hit record, for this episode, I mean, you have your own podcast speaking about being single at 30. I don't even know how I found you. I think I literally searched those words and your podcast came up. I'm pretty sure that's how it happened. Anyway, I love the idea that there are certain things in our lives that we have an expectation about. We think that we should be in a certain place at a certain time of our lives. We have a number associated with a picture of what our life's meant to look like. I don't know if you're aware of this idea. It sort of goes, let me paint it for you. Actually, no, you tell me, what do you think is the timeline expectation we have of our lives? What's the idea of it in your mind?
Well, I think that for women, it's very different for women compared to men. But I definitely think that a lot of women think that by the age of 30, they are going to have everything in their life worked out. You know, they will have met their forever person. They will be in a position with their career where they can start a family. They will have the white picket fence, the dog, and the children on the way. And for a lot of people, that is not how it's turning out. And I think that that is leading to a lot of stress, pressure, and anxiety. And that was certainly the case for me. And it is certainly the case for a lot of my listeners. And I love that you said you searched those words because I hear that a lot, because I think that a lot of people are dealing with the mismatch. They've reached their 30s and they're like, okay, things don't look the way I thought it would.
Totally. And, I think there's something super reassuring for someone who's listening who's like, oh my God, that's exactly my life you just painted right there. But even for someone who's listening who maybe has some of that picture, like maybe you've got the partner, maybe you've got the ring, maybe you've got a child, there's always this element of the thing that has not turned out the way you thought at this specific age. Maybe it's that you thought you'd have a house but you don't, or you thought maybe it's taking longer to have a child, or maybe you're realizing you don't want children and everyone's asking you about it. Like there are so many different ways. And then there's career as well. Like I thought I would be here in my career, I thought I'd be there, and it's not panning out the way I thought. So I hope anyone listening is gonna take something of value from this. We are going to talk about in the context of being single at 30, which is like, it's annoying to me now that that's even a thing. That like
Right.
it's
Mhm.
such a thing though.
It's such a thing. Like there's so much shame around it. And I love what you were saying before as well, because I feel like it's important to also recognize that there's a lot of people out there who have checked all of those boxes, but for some reason they're not happy because they're just boxes. They don't actually lead to, fulfillment for a lot of people. Like, but we're almost conditioned, like we were discussing before, to think that it will. And that's not necessarily the case. And that's okay as well.
Totally. And just to put this into context too, Nicole, I like it's been something I've been processing for the last 2 to 3 years. Like basically just before lockdown, I found myself unexpectedly single and then went into the whole lockdown thing, which was interesting on the well, I had to heal, but also on the dating scene, and all the things were so many experiences. And I found myself with all my friends starting to become engaged, getting married. I went through 7 weddings in a row, like weekend after
Wow.
weekend at one point last summer, which was quite it's like I see myself as someone very strong mentally and emotionally. I've got all the tools. I help people with this stuff, but we're still challenged in our lives. And that's been my big challenge to move through, was like keeping my sanity
Mhm.
when all the peers around you, the people we hang out with, set our sense of what's normal. And it
Mhm.
was such a different kind of, what I was living was so different to my friends at the time. And so listening to your podcast and hearing your words of wisdom and your experience and all the people you interview on your show was something that just provided me with that extra voice of like, it's okay. There are other people who also are experiencing this, and you are still a perfectly valid human being.
Exactly. And I completely resonate with what you're saying because when we initially went into lockdown for the first time in 2020, I actually just broke up with somebody who I found out was cheating on me and had impregnated his ex. I was also moving to New York and I found out all of this news the week before we went into lockdown. So, like you, I had to sit in my lounge room staring at the wall, just like, starting the healing process. And it was super confronting. And all of my friends were in relationships. I was the only single person in lockdown with my cat at the age of like 30 or 31, whatever it was. And I was like, wow, this is not how I thought my life was going to turn out. But, having now interviewed so many incredible and inspiring women on my podcast and doing the work that I do, I've recognized that everyone's timeline is completely different, and it only makes sense looking backwards. Like, had I not gone through all of that, I wouldn't be able to resonate with my clients the way I do now, but at the time I was like, why is this happening to me? And just because somebody may appear to be ahead of you doesn't mean that their life is any more valuable, like you said, than yours. It's just that for whatever reason, they have met their partner or their career has fallen into place, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen for you. And I know that that's so difficult to remind yourself of those, when you're in that moment.
It's so true. And I think I found it quite fascinating to watch the way that my mind has like reacted. I'm going to use the word reaction because it's that unconscious like reflex you can't help to that environment. And it brings up an unworthiness and it brings up a shame, and it's like, where has this come from? And it was so fascinating. I don't know if you kind of, I mean, no, I do know that you did that work on yourself as well, exploring where is this conditioning and where
Mhm.
does it originate. For me, it was looking at things I'd never noticed before. Certain messaging, like in my family, from my
Oh,
parents,
yeah.
so subtle, but noticing, oh, hang on, my mum gets very excited about babies. My mum has always talked about grandchildren, da da da, and all this stuff. And it's so interesting to see how subtle that can be. What was it like for you picking apart that sense of conditioning and looking into that, exploring that for yourself?
Well, it's interesting that you're using the word subtle because in my case, it certainly wasn't subtle. And I totally relate to what you're saying because I would go to weddings or baby showers and I would get triggered because people would come up to me and just interrogate me about my single status, almost as if it was like a mental condition or a disease. And, you've listened to the podcast, but I actually loved being single. Like, it was a really precious time for me to work on myself and what was going on in between my ears because I had come out of all of these toxic relationships, like the guy who impregnated his ex, stuff like that just kept happening to me. So I really enjoyed my own company, but B, enjoyed the opportunity I had to work on myself and figure out what was the patterning behind, all of my relationships and why did I constantly find myself in these situations. But yeah, I mean, our conditioning, it's overwhelming. There is a societal expectation for women in particular that we will find a partner before our biological clock runs out. But at the same time, that we'll also now have a thriving career and we'll also look 20 for our entire lives. It's a lot, it's in the advertisements that we see, the movies that we watch, like the music that we listen to. Every time you look at Instagram, there's hashtag couple goals, people seemingly looking like they're in the most incredible relationships where they're being flown all around the world together. It's everywhere. But the reality is, it's actually really, really hard to find somebody you can grow with for the rest of your life. It's really, really hard to co create healthy relationships because most people aren't modeled them growing up, So it may seem like that's the norm, but it actually isn't. And that's what we have to remind ourselves of when we are being triggered. Just because everybody else seems to be like they have it all worked out doesn't actually mean they do.
And it's so fascinating the way that create this illusion of these perfect relationships, and the idea of like the knight in shining armor is going to come and save me and then all my problems will be resolved. It kind of can it can do two things. It can make us feel shame for being single, and then there's those questions of like, that have inherent judgment in them, like, why are you still single?
Mhm.
What do you think of that question, Nicole?
Well, you know what? Like I thought about this a lot because when I was single and I was single for 9 years, it wasn't difficult for me to find a guy I could date. Like that wasn't the issue. And I think most women don't actually have that issue. You could probably find a boyfriend tonight if you went out. My issue was finding somebody I was compatible with, that I shared the same values with, and, the same shared vision for our futures. Like, it's, why are you still single? It's like, well, how long do you have? Because I'm actually looking for somebody I can, do life with. I want a life partner. I don't just want somebody to fill a void or, eat dinner with on a Saturday night. So, whereas I think a lot of people are just ticking boxes, or they are just falling into relationships because it's too scary to face themselves, or they're fearful that they might end up alone. Like I think that the people who are single are actually in many ways more courageous because they're choosing themselves.
Absolutely. And that's the other element I was going to mention before I went off into the, what do you think that question? Are you still single? Because I don't want it to be like judgmental, but it is an interesting question to ask that I don't think people who are not single think about. Like they don't
Yeah,
think that that's coming with that element. But the other element is that because there's this shame, people stay in relationships that aren't necessarily serving them because there's this
100%.
perception that that's better than being alone.
100%. There's almost like it is almost more acceptable to get divorced than it is to be single. And I think that there's something wrong with that. We should be celebrating people taking their time, getting to know who they are, what they really want out of a partner, as opposed to just rushing into relationships that aren't actually right for them or, like you said, serving them.
Totally. And just it's got me to a place where I'm kind of like in acceptance of and clarity, which is a nice place to be, of what I'm looking for, in the sense of not like he has dark hair and he's this height and like blah blah blah. Like I've got those lists, I've made plenty of them and burnt them. That's all happened, as we all do. But in terms of the feeling of that relationship.
I love
And
that you said that. I love that. I always say that to my clients because I was guilty of that as well in my early 20s. Like tall, dark, and handsome, this sort of career. I had the image of what I wanted him to look like. And then it took me 9 years of being single to realize that none of that actually mattered. And now I always advise my clients to focus more on how do you feel when you're around them? Are you yourself? Can you fully express yourself, as opposed to do they have hair? Are they 6 foot? How much money do they have in their bank account? That stuff doesn't matter long term.
no, it doesn't. And I think there's an element of like, I think we've all experienced falling for someone or finding someone really attractive. And you're like, this is so weird. Like, when I first looked at them, I wasn't into them, but now I am. And there's an element there which I find interesting to look at. I don't know if you've noticed this, Nicole, where it's like, oh, hang on, that attraction is coming from childhood wounding.
Right?
This is not the good,
Absolutely.
yeah, this is not the healthy kind, versus that warm home like feeling that's not home like in the chaotic sense. It's home like in the, I'm safe, I can just be myself, I don't feel like I need to hide.
No, I love that you're saying that because I had a very chaotic upbringing. So I mirrored that in my relationships. I always felt like I had to fight or earn approval or love from my partners because that's what was modeled to me. So, the highs and lows of relationships were what I found attractive, was what I normalized. And now with my current partner, at the beginning, it was just so easy. It was so peaceful. And I was like, do we have chemistry? Are we actually like connected? And I realized that that is what a healthy relationship looks like. But like I was saying before, that's not often modeled to a lot of us. I think that that's actually the exception if that's what your upbringing looked like. So it's, yeah, rewiring your sort of like understanding of what a relationship should look and feel like.
Exactly. And I've come to an understanding in myself of, well, it's not going to be one of those things where I'm going to just, I can't see myself settling in a situation of chaos or like push pull dynamic. Like it
Mhm.
needs to be comfortable. And only then, if that happens, will I invite a child into this world.
Right?
I just can't.
Absolutely.
I can't see it happening any other way. And so I'm sort of surrendered to that experience. And if that doesn't happen for me, I'm kind of coming to that acceptance of I would rather not have a child in a chaotic, like unhealthy partnership than go through that and bring a child into that situation.
That was the point I reached as well. Like, I was always very much the sort of person who was like, I love children, but unless I meet the right person, I'm not going to bring a child into this world. And that was a personal decision. I know a lot of women who don't have that same perspective, and that's totally fine. But for me, it was more important to find a partner who was my best friend and I could really I knew with absolute certainty was going to make a good father. And then I also reached the point that if I met somebody who didn't want kids, that was okay as well. Because at the end of the day, I want to be with somebody and start a family with somebody who that is something they 100% want as well. So I think that that's actually a really good place to reach, like that place of acceptance.
Yeah, and it's been really interesting. My sister, who's a little older than me, is having a baby by herself, which is such an amazing thing. I'm so proud of her. With her gay best friend. Like it's the
Oh, I
most
love that.
it's
I
so
spoke about that
beautiful.
with my gay best friend. That was something we like said, well, maybe if we never meet our forever people, we should have a kid together. It's a great idea.
And these options exist. I think for me, I've kind of thought about it and I've been like, I don't know if that's the route that I could see myself going. I think I would rather, experience being a mother in other ways because that's such an interesting question too of like, do we have to birth a child, grow a child in our body and birth that child to be a mother or to have that kind of experience in this life? I don't know. There are so many ways.
Yeah, I actually interviewed an incredible, incredible woman on the podcast recently who's in her 40s. She's been married for 20 years, and her and her partner made the conscious decision to not have children. But she is like, I am a mother in different ways. All my friends have children, and I, often babysit them. And that is a very important relationship that I value very dearly. And she is also a cat mom. Her brother also has children. There's other ways that you can sort of fulfill that maternal urge or role that's like inherent to all women. And, I've always had an urge to adopt children one day. And it's still very much inside of me. So I feel like our options are endless. They don't have to look the sort of way that we've all been conditioned to think it should look.
So true. I will say though, at this moment in time, my preference would be to at some point experience birthing my own child and having that situation, but there's no guarantees and you just don't know what's going to happen in life. So I'm kind of like in a state of openness, hopefulness, but also surrender because who knows, this stuff is completely out of our control in so many ways.
Absolutely. And it's so true because even if you were to meet the love of your life tomorrow and you guys got married and then you decide that the natural next step was to have kids, like you said, there's no guarantees that you're even going to be able to fall pregnant. So that's a reality that we all face, and it's true about our relationship status. Just because you meet the love of your life tomorrow doesn't mean that in the like next 12 months that you could go back to being single, and we're seeing a lot of examples of that. A lot of people getting married and then within the first 2 years they're breaking up. So nothing is guaranteed in life, nothing is certain.
It is like immense the societal pressure that just like overcomes everyone at that 30 plus or minus 2 years kind of zone. And it depends on like your social circles and where you are. I think, Nicole, you're from Sydney. I'm from Melbourne. A lot of my, inner city sort of environment, there's a similar kind of sense of what the timeline is. It's somehow interestingly different in rural areas. Like everything's a little bit
Totally.
earlier.
Yeah.
So a lot of like I've got friends who grew up in that sort of environment who are a little bit like maybe they've accepted that because it happened earlier in their lives that they were like, oh, things are off the timeline, it's all cool. So it's so interesting how it varies, but still, people can be so pressured that they yeah can get into a situation that's not perfect because it's like, well, this is what we do now. We just get married.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of people are ignoring the sort of red flags or deal breakers at the beginning of the relationship because they are so uh mesmerized by this, idea that we've all been sold that we are supposed to get married by a certain age.
Yeah.
So instead of actually being like, well, are we actually compatible? They're just focused on ticking that box. And that's where a lot of people are going wrong. And then once you do get married, reality sets in and you're just stuck with each other. And then you also realize, okay, but we're now stuck with each other forever. And I feel like a lot of people are realizing that perhaps they didn't make the right decision.
Yeah, which is so it's so interesting how that carrot dangling, it's like saying marriage is happiness. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and I have nothing wrong with people making that decision because I'm like that's beautiful. I just my one thing, because I've thought about this a fair bit, what's the difference in the people who it feels different about? It's like, have you taken the moment to step back and question
Hmm.
and just feel into yourself as an
Hmm.
individual? Is this right for me at my time of life? Are the values aligned? All of those things. Have we questioned the societal BS?
Right. And I feel like a lot of people aren't doing that. And I don't even think it's a conscious thing. I think that we just actually haven't been taught what's important when it comes to creating healthy relationships, what's important when it comes to committing to a life partner. Like a lot of us actually don't know how to be in a healthy relationship with ourselves, let alone with somebody else. So it's no surprise that a lot of relationships aren't working out. And, what's interesting is that men are also rushing into this. So the pressure is obviously also felt by men, not just women, which I find very interesting because, it's shocking to see that these men are getting down on one knee and proposing, and then the relationship is ending within a year or two.
I'm so glad you brought that up actually, because it is such a stereotype of like the idea of the desperate single woman in her 30s, like, someone marry me, please, I have to have babies. And yet, as you kind of are experiencing the reality, yeah, there are a lot of men who are also in that situation. And it doesn't matter if we kind of have this perception that men can just like have forever and they don't have the biological clock. A lot of men don't want to be like an old, necessarily like a much older father. They want to have the energy, they want to have that experience in their lives too.
Absolutely. And when I was single, I found more often than not that it was the men putting pressure on me to get married and have children. Because, like I said, I was very clear, like, if I don't meet the right person, I'm not going to have children. It was not even a priority to me. And I was more focused on trying to identify if that person could be my best friend and my life partner. Whereas I would go on dates and I would feel interrogated by men. They would be like, I want to get married by X and I want to have two children by X. And I would literally respond to them like, whoa, I am not a baby factory. Like, take it down a notch. Let's just take time to get to know one another. So I definitely see that sense of urgency and that expectation from a lot of men.
Yeah, absolutely. See, this is why I love you and I loved listening to your show, because I needed that dose, like that reminder of, hang on, remember what this is all about, because so powerful is, I would say, it's almost like peer pressure.
Oh,
It,
yeah,
it's so powerful, our
absolutely.
need to belong and fit in and feel like we're doing the same thing that everyone else is doing.
And that's such a good point because we're relational beings, right? Like we like that sense of community. We like that sense of like togetherness. And that's why we compare ourselves to others because we want to fit in. We want to be part of like a tribe. And unfortunately, there are expectations the older we get in order to remain in that tribe. It's just the truth of the matter when people enter relationships and all of a sudden they're going for dinners, they're going on couple dinners, or couple weekend away, weekends away with the, couple friends, or, then all of a sudden you become part of like mothers groups and it just like becomes more and more layered the older you get. Whereas when you're all in school together or university, you're all doing the same thing. You're studying and you're partying on the weekends together, but things change the older you get. And unfortunately, friendships slip away or, just the dynamic changes.
That is probably one of the most painful parts. I think for me, I've always been generally okay in my own company. I can meet my own needs in many respect without being
Yeah.
hyper independent about the whole thing. But it's the sense of I can't relate to my friends and sit there for hours and hours in the topics of conversation that they want to
Mhm.
talk about. I can talk about these things, but I don't have as much bandwidth as they do because you're just sharing different experiences of life. Nicole, any tips or advice for dealing with a situation where you've got a friendship group or some friends who are, yeah, doing something differently to you and how you're living your life, and that's all they want to talk about?
Yeah, I feel really passionately about this topic because I am, I love kids and I love love. I mean, my career is all about it, right? But I also am very much the type of woman who is like, I'm a bit of a Samantha. Like, just because you have kids, I don't want to talk about them 24/7. Do you know what I mean? And it's like the same with, if I'm hanging out with a guy who's super ambitious, I don't want to talk about his career 24/7. Like, I think it's important to still be multifaceted and still be able to have, a dialogue about lots of different things. So if you have a friendship group that, maybe they're all married or partnered up, or maybe they're all just starting to have babies and you're not at that stage of your life, my tip would be get friends who are on the same level as you, get friends who nourish you in different ways so that you don't feel like you're left out or that your friends don't understand you or that that's all you have to talk about, because it's certainly not the case. And I definitely diversified my friendship groups. I put myself out there in lots of different situations. I was in a meditation group, I had lots of different people that I could turn to so that I wasn't just bombarded with the baby talk or the wedding talk or the engagement talk, because it is overwhelming. And particularly if you're like somebody like me, who I wouldn't even want a baby shower, I wouldn't even want a wedding. So that stuff didn't even really appeal to me, even though I wasn't at that stage in my life.
It's funny you bring that up because I think that's something that's shifted for me too. Like I used to think, oh yeah, like wedding sounds fun. I love attention. Why not just like have this big party? That sounds really great. Whereas these days now I'm like, I don't know anymore. I don't know. It
Yeah.
because of seeing, and again, this is not to cast a judgment. It's more just an understanding and awareness of myself that I've come to, where I'm like, I don't know if it means as much to me anymore because I'm not so bought into the idea that the wedding day is the most amazing day of my life that I could possibly ever aspire to, and that finding this person is going to solve all of my life problems and make me happy forever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love that you say that, because I'm obviously now in a relationship and like a wedding is really important to my partner, but we both hate being the center of attention. I'm like, so why are we going to put ourselves through that pain and suffering of having everyone look at us just on this weird one day, that everyone gets so excited about? But, I feel like, yeah, the older we get, the less we like seductive the idea of like this over the top expensive day becomes for a lot of people, but I do know for a lot of people it also is, a representation of their love, and they want to enjoy that moment with everyone who knows and loves them as a couple. So I just think it's a personal decision, and you have to be honest with yourself and you have to honor that. And I think it's the same for children.
So true. Okay, I definitely want to share with everyone because those who don't know you, Nicole, you started this podcast single at 30,
Yes.
at a time when you were single at 30.
Correct.
And
Yes.
then was it like season two? You made this episode like confession.
No, it was season 4. I didn't tell my audience or my listeners until like, yeah, season 4, episode 1.
Kept this big secret, which is just I love the irony of this story. It is just
Oh
so
God. Yeah.
so hilarious.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, tell us the story. What was going on when you started the podcast?
Yeah, so I was single for 9 years. 3 of those years, no, sorry, 5 of those years, I kind of took a dating hiatus. I dated, but I just knew in my head that I was not going to commit to someone fully. I just wasn't there. I wasn't open to it. And then for 3 of those years, I basically approached dating like a full-time job. Like I was just ready to meet somebody and I was determined to put myself out there in order to meet somebody. And throughout that process, I realized, wow, okay, dating is actually difficult, and it's really hard to meet the right person for you. And I would come home from each of my dates and basically just shoot off voice notes to my friends and family about what took place on that date. And my friends were just like, you need to air this to a wider audience. Like, I don't think that this happens to most people, and you need to share it so that women don't feel alone. Because I just turned 30, and I was like, wow, there's so much pressure on women to have, like we've been discussing, everything sorted by the age of 30. And I am just struggling. Like, I'm keep putting myself out there, and I'm met with just like such disappointment, and sometimes I was even traumatized by my experiences. So I came home from one traumatic date in particular, and I was like, how can I just create a one-stop shop where I basically air the reality of what, it's like being a single woman at the age of 30. And then the name Single at 30 came to me, and I was like, all right, I'm going to do this podcast. And so then I basically made the decision to do the podcast. I started interviewing all these amazing women, and literally the week I launched the podcast, I met my now partner, and I met him at the same co-working space that I was working on the podcast at. And I was just like, I had been so disappointed in my dating life for so long that there was no way that I expected him to be the person I ended up in a relationship with and now living with and now have a dog with. Like, that did not even cross my mind. I was just so used to, oh, this will be over in like a matter of weeks, if not months. And so I made the very conscious decision to not tell him about the podcast. And I certainly didn't want to tell my audience until I knew that it was something serious. And unlike all of the guys who would normally love bomb me or do a big song and dance, my current partner was a very, very, very slow burn. Like, it took him 10 whole months to tell me that he loved me. So I wanted to honor our process and like keep it like, private until I really knew what it was. And that's why it took until season 4 to tell my listeners that I was in a relationship. And it took me 5 months to tell him that I even had the podcast going on.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I want to share with you, Nicole. I listened to that episode as I was walking along a beach in Portugal. And
Oh, wow. I love that.
yeah, and like having this moment, I don't know what it was specifically that struck me, but it made me emotional, and just to share that as someone who was listening to your story, because it inspires this hope when there is so much disappointment
Oh,
and there
yeah.
are so many moments of like, oh, like I hope my hope is right, but I don't know. And it was just beautiful to hear that. What do you think about this idea? There is this perception, particularly for a self-aware, intelligent woman who is single at this time of her life. There is a lot of advice out there about love yourself first,
Yeah.
and when you're not looking, that's when you find them, and all of these things. How much do you place importance into that versus this just being something that's so random and out of our control?
This is such a good question. And I've thought a lot about this question. So we were talking about modeling and patterning before, and, our wounding and all of that. And like I said, I grew up in a very chaotic home environment. And because of that, I modeled a lot of unhealthy traits and then mirrored that in my relationships. And it wasn't until I took that dating hiatus and took a time out to really reflect on what was going on between my ears, why I kept finding myself in all of these toxic relationships, that I was able to identify what was going on for me. And so, in a sense, I do think it is really important, if you have been unsuccessful in your love life, to get to the why behind that. And if you are in, if you haven't yet learned to really be in a healthy relationship with yourself, I do think it is incredibly difficult to then have a healthy relationship with somebody else. So for me, I did need to reach that point where I understood the why behind why I always found myself in these toxic relationships. And once I started realizing that, I also was able to realized that, I actually was lovable. I was able to start, responding from my worth instead of my wounding, and realizing that this was just stuff that I had modeled. This wasn't actually me. It was just I had normalized red flags. I wasn't actually the problem, but my unconscious patterning and attractions were. And then I was able to start cultivating a really healthy relationship with myself. And admittedly, when I was working at the co-working space, I did sign up there because I was like, I'm obviously not going to meet my partner on a Saturday night. All my friends are partnered up. I'm obviously not going to be introduced to a single guy. I need to put myself in an environment where I'm meeting like-minded people. So it was a very conscious decision to surround myself with people who were on the same page and wavelength as me. But I must say that at the time I was working at the co-working space, it was also the happiest point in my life. And I mentioned this in that same episode that you were listening to in Portugal, I think it was. A friend of mine really wanted to set me up with somebody she thought was my future husband. And I turned to her and said, just give me 6 months. I'm not ready. Like, I was just so happy working on the podcast. I was surrounded by all these amazing people who were becoming my friends. A boyfriend was the last thing on my mind. And it was also the very same time I started dating Nick and he came into my life. Because I think that, when you don't have so much pressure on yourself and you're able to just enjoy your life, that's when you're the most attractive to other people. And you're also the most open and receptive to letting love in, but so long as you feel like you're unlovable and you're constantly searching for somebody to sort of like complete you, you're not really going to attract people who are in alignment with your true and authentic self. So that's what I have to say. But I also have to say that you do not have to be fully healed to be in a relationship. I really think that that's when the true work begins.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting one too, as right, because there's so much growth and healing that happens in relationships as well.
Absolutely.
And then
Absolutely.
there is the element of the flawed premise in the whole argument as well, and just for interest's sake, which is that, you know, the idea that everyone that's in a happy relationship and has met someone, and let's say they are happy together and like in a healthy dynamic, as though each one of those people has done all of this work on themselves, which isn't necessarily the case.
Definitely not. Definitely not. And that's why I say it's so hard to find somebody you can grow with, because you both have to have a willingness to co-create a healthy relationship, and you both have to choose each other every single day. Like you said, falling in love, when it comes to healthy relationships, like, you are choosing to be in love. It's very intentional, and it's something that you both have to choose every single day.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I couldn't agree more that it's something that's such a beautiful opportunity to cultivate, like that self love relationship with yourself, do that inner work. For me, I'm at that point where I feel I have done so much of that inner work. Like, I can't tell you how much. And it's like, even in Portugal, I was in such like the happiest time of my life. Like I remember sending my friends voice notes saying like, I am the happiest I have ever been in my life without being in that situation where I'm on a high because I'm falling in love with someone, which
Yeah.
was such a cool place to be. And it's funny how, yeah, I suppose the work is to just keep being there and finding those moments and, keep doing the work
Well, it's
and
interesting because I
surrender.
thought a lot. Yeah. That's the key word, surrender, because I thought a lot about this because I reached the same point as you. I saw everyone around me fall in love, partner up, get engaged, get married. And I was like, but I've done all the work. I've literally been studying and living and breathing this stuff for 9 years. Why hasn't it happened to me? Yeah. And I interviewed Kate Rose, the author of You Only Fall in Love Three Times, who you have to listen to that episode if you haven't already. She
I
is.
listened to it twice.
Oh, right. Okay. And
I
she
loved it.
says, I asked her this question, this exact question, because I have clients who cry to me about this, but I'm doing the work. Like, why hasn't it happened to me yet? And she said they need to stop doing, because so long as you're busy studying, there's a part of you that's not open to receiving yet. You have not basically, you don't believe it in yourself that you're ready to receive it yet. And that's why you're so focused on doing. She's like, just be open to receiving. And that's why I think it happened for me when I did sign up to that co-working space, because I stopped. I just surrendered, like you said, and I just I was living my life. It was the first time that I felt like I no longer had to work on myself. I could just enjoy my life. So that would be my advice to anyone who, like yourself, is like, but I've done the work. It's like, okay, so then just surrender to it, just, don't be so preoccupied with when it's going to happen, what the timeline looks like. Just live your life now because you love yourself. You're worthy of love. You're also willing to give that sort of love. So just surrender to the moment.
I love how much, we started before we talked about doing this episode. We were talking about like just letting it go and letting it flow off the cuff. And I'm so glad we have, because we've reached this moment. And these are the moments that you can't plan, where I'm
Totally.
just so glad we're having this conversation, because whether this is someone listening to this who's literally in this situation of single and like, when's it going to happen and blah, 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 or it's someone who is waiting to fall pregnant, or
Yeah.
waiting to get the next promotion or get the business going off the ground or
Right.
all the
Right.
things. It's like
Yeah.
there's a limit, there's a point where you've done so much of that work. And I want to speak for those women who are like, but I've done the work and I'm
Yeah.
pulling my hair out. Like, I'm so tired of waiting. It's like, what then? And I
But
think
you
it's
know
like,
what? Like, sorry to cut you off, but I love what you're saying because, you know, if it was your career, right? You study to get certain skills, right? And then you put yourself out there and you work on whatever, whether it's like climbing the corporate ladder or being an entrepreneur, you work on it every single day. And you don't know when you're going to become an overnight success or hit the, milestones or KPIs or the goals that you have in mind, but you keep taking action. But where I feel like a lot of women struggle is they just say they kind of like hide behind the work. Well, I've done the work. It's like, okay, we'll go on a date. Leave your house. He's not going to climb out of your television on a Saturday night. And that was something that I was really proactive with my dating life. Like I put myself out there. Like I said, I approached it like a full-time job. I think that there is a difference between doing the work and taking a passive role and also like accepting and recognizing that it's going to happen for you. So, therefore, taking action that's going to make it happen for you.
yeah, I think what we're talking about here is the difference between surrender and resignation.
Yes. Yes.
Resignation is where we are like kind of almost despondent, almost like a little depressed, almost like flat, and just like, ugh, I'm just exhausted by this whole thing.
Yeah.
Versus surrender, which is should feel like a light feeling, a free feeling, a let it go.
There should be an excitement. Like
Yeah.
you should be excited to put yourself out there because you're going to meet the love of your life. Like, how is that not the most exciting prospect ever? Whereas I feel like a lot of women are disheartened and they're almost accepting the very thing that they are resisting the most. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like they're not taking action because they already accept the fact that they're not going to meet their person. And so long as you have that mindset, it's just not going to happen for you. And I was in that mindset for a very long time. So I'm speaking from experience when I say that.
It's funny how our anxious mind will have us
Yes.
forecast into the future. Like, Nicole, there have been times when I haven't been listening to stuff about single at 30. I've been listening to things like single at 40. My mind wanting to forecast, well, would I be okay if I was? Like, do I need to be okay with like a decade of this? Which is like, I catch myself and I share that because of I'm just like amazed at how we can get into these spaces of trying to forecast and ultimately trying to control what we have no
Yes.
control over.
Right. And it's so true. And like, obviously I was single for 9 years. I really didn't know if I was ever going to meet my person. And now I am in a relationship and I'm 33. I'm going on 34. And I want to freeze my eggs because, like I said, I'm not ready for children just yet, but it is something that I want to do one day with my partner. But I can't tell you how much resistance I have towards starting the process. Like, I'm terrified to get my fertility checked. In some sense, I'm already accepting the worst case scenario, and what I'm trying to say is like, no matter what age or stage you're at, there's always going to be, a challenging road ahead. You're always going to be unsure of what it's going to look like, but you've just got to persist forward. You've just got to be, as positive as possible, but it is so hard. And if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, I would have been the disheartened person who wasn't sure if I was going to one day meet my person. So, it's just, you got to honor the space that you're in, and it's not easy, but you've got to continue moving forward at the same time.
So true. And applying the same logic as what you were saying about like doing the work and then just going out and living your life, which I
Yeah.
think is brilliant advice because so many of us do get stuck in the work and the study and the like, I've got to be perfect before I can go out and actually do stuff, and it stops us from actually doing anything. Um,
Exactly.
in this case, right, it would be instead of buying into the idea that it's all going to be terrible and worst case scenario, it would be let's take action and find out what happens. Like from that place of it could be, yes, it might be disappointing news, but it also might equally be wonderful news because life is good and bad.
Exactly. And just like accepting it for what it is. Your timeline might look different. Like you might have fertility issues. It might take you longer to fall pregnant than other people, or you might have to look at different avenues. Like we don't know what what is in store for us. So it's like relinquishing control and accepting it for what it is, which is so difficult to do when we have been sold this, preconceived idea of what our life should look like.
Yeah, I think almost a more difficult one than the being a woman who's single is the being a woman who is single and childless. Like
Yeah.
the idea that being a mother makes you a worthwhile human being. And it's interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but I would say we have like I've felt the fear around that. Like, what if I don't ever have that validation of having my own child, which says I have, lived and fulfilled all the things that a woman needs to experience in her life. Um, and yet, ultimately, when I think about that, I'm like, well, that would be really hard. That would be a grieving process to grieve that part of my identity that might may never come to fruition. But equally, I would move through that. And I know myself that I have the ability to make a meaning of my life that serves me, to tell a story that serves me, and I would get through it.
Absolutely. And I think that that's why these types of conversations are so important, because there are some women who make a conscious decision to not become mothers. And for some other women, they simply can't, or it just hasn't happened for them yet because they haven't met their person. Um, but it's interesting because I have an ex-boyfriend who once asked me if my stepmom feels like she's failed in her role as a woman because she hasn't had children of her own, even though she inherited my brother and I when she married my dad. So there definitely is a lot of external pressure that women have to, carry the burden of. And, you know, I have been to baby showers and weddings where people have literally shamed me and said, "You never were maternal, were you?" And it's like, well, I have a cat. And if you saw me with my cat, you would know how maternal I am because I cry when I have to leave her to go to work. Like, yes, I am. But I just wasn't that woman who was like, I'm 100% going to be a mother one day, And I think that, like I said before, it's a personal decision. And regardless of what your decision is or what stage you're at in your life, it's something that you have to honor and you have to be at peace with. And you can't let other people shame you because you do or don't have children. Because even when you do become a mom, you're going to deal with other shame, like it doesn't just end once you become a mother. So I think that all that matters is how you feel about where you're at in your life.
And ultimately, I find that the most heartening thing about any kind of timeline anxiety about the timing of your life or the expectations for your life not panning out the way you thought, because we are all connected no matter what the flavor of our experience is. My current flavor happens to be managing this whole single at 30 thing, but for other people it's still a similar feeling, it's just a different context. And that whether that is the children thing, the career thing, all sorts of different things, it's like ultimately we can all be united in that in some way.
Right. Yeah, like we need to stop judging people because, our anxiety is never going to go away. It's just going to change, like finally feel really comfortable in my career and I'm now got my partner. But like I said, I've got anxiety surrounding, my fertility. And that's why I've got resistance to going to getting my fertility checked, and then I'll have anxiety about potentially becoming a mother and what that is then going to mean about my career. And it just never ends. So we need to put the judgment aside and just support each other, regardless of what stage they're at in their journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it slightly differently, that the anxiety or the our anxious mind, our mind is always going to produce anxiety. Like it can
Absolutely.
always find something to feel anxious about. There'll always be another problem and another problem, and I'm no different even though I support women with this. But when we have an awareness around it, it's like we can put one foot in another bucket and always have a different perspective at the same time. So I sort of find myself like it's almost like ping pong ball, like in my head, like going back and forth of there's the fear part, and then I'm like, well, hang on, don't forget there's all these other perspectives too. That makes it, I would say, not so easy to go into a full blown spiral because you've
Yeah.
always got one foot at least on a certain solid surface within yourself.
Absolutely. And, if you do find yourself spiraling, I think it's important to remind yourself of all of this and also look back on how far you've come. Like, it's so easy to become overwhelmed when you are projecting yourself into the future and you feel like you haven't arrived at all the places that you need to be at. But if you look back on, well, what would my 20-year-old self think of where I'm at right now, you'll realize that, everything does fall into place the way it's meant to. We've just got to practice patience and trust in the process, which is so difficult to do. But by having conversations like this and, adopting tools like the ones that we're talking about, it becomes a lot easier.
Totally, absolutely. What would you say for someone right now who is struggling to find that patience in their life of waiting for the thing to happen?
Yeah. For me personally, I think that the reason I lacked patience was because I was externalizing too much. I wanted somebody to sort of like fill my bucket. I wanted somebody to complete me in a lot of ways. And I didn't realize that I could feel complete all on my own. And once I realized that and I started to fill my own bucket, I got really good at being patient. That sense of urgency went away because I felt whole on my own. I felt complete on my own. I started to love my life and myself throughout that process. So I feel like when we have that sense of urgency or we are impatient, it's because we're actually lacking something internally that we need to give ourselves, And I understand that there's that biological clock that, all of us, we face that pressure. Whether we are conscious of it or not. But like we've discussed, there are other ways that we can become a mother, So it's like relinquishing control and not being so focused on the outcome. If it's something you want, you will find a way. It just might not look the way you thought it would. And that's just life. And we have to accept that about life.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful advice. And I would say one thing I was reflecting on not long ago was just how I feel I have grieved the expectations that I had that made it so difficult the last couple of years. And now I'm in this place of it does feel like there's time and there's space. And I'm kind of like, what will be in some ways too. So it's really nice. I know what you mean.
Yeah. And also, like, I was the girl who was always in a relationship. Like, I had a high school sweetheart, followed by a relationship straight after that. I never could have imagined that I was going to be single for 9 years. But I feel like there's a lesson in everything that we're going through. So, my advice would be like, try to identify why this is happening, and what you can take away from it and, what it's trying to teach you, so that you can apply it to like it will benefit you in the future. Like I would not be the sort of person that I am in a relationship now if I hadn't have gone through those 9 years. And I am so grateful for that journey now because of it.
Oh, so true. I appreciate that so much, Nicole. I can't believe it. Like, we've hit the hour. Like,
Oh
this
my
is, yeah,
God,
did
no
that not just
way.
rush by?
It did. Oh my God, it really did. Yeah, there's a lot in there as
I
well.
feel like we got the two of us together and boom, boom, boom. Like, there was not a moment where I didn't know, like, what to ask you next. That was
Oh, I
beautiful.
love that.
Thank
No,
you so much for coming on the show. It
thank
has
you for
just
having
been
me.
fabulous to speak with you. And I just, again, am so appreciative of the way that you have opened up a place to safely talk about this kind of stuff and make people feel less alone in whatever experience they're going through.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Georgie, for having me. It's been so lovely speaking to you today.
Thanks, Nicole. Has this episode left you wanting more? Consider joining the Anxiety Reset program. I'll be there supporting you live each month, and weekly videos take you through simple steps that you can implement at your own pace. Over 90 days, we reprogram your mind to reduce negative thinking, release the need to be perfect, build confidence, feel okay with uncertainty, and finally let go. You'll create deep relaxation and calm by addressing your gut health, hormones, nutrition, and more all in one. You really can master your anxious mind. Let's do it together. Learn more with the link in the show notes. Thank you for listening. We have reached the end of this episode. If you enjoy this podcast and you find it helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would hit subscribe or share this episode on your Instagram stories and make sure you tag at Georgie the Naturopath. But that is all for today. Please be kind to yourselves. Know that you are enough and you are exactly where you need to be.